Music Learning Conversation podcast. Brought to you by You Can Play.
Hello and welcome to the Music Learning Conversation podcast. This episode is focusing on key moments in our lives that have shaped our thinking and pointed us in new directions, whether that be as musicians or educators or both. For me, Andy, I had a traditional classical music education. I was a piano player when I was younger, and I learnt percussion through Surrey County Music Service and enjoyed playing in orchestras locally and nationally. And that was great, and I really loved it. But when I went to university and did my music degree, and then when I moved into my postgraduate certificate of education course, I was really challenged by somebody who came to visit and ran some sessions. His name was Ben Higham, and in 1995, when he came to the University of East Anglia and ran some sessions with us as a postgraduate group of students, he introduced us to pieces from the community music world. And this was a complete revelation to me. It was such a contrasting way to engage with music that changed the way I thought about how somebody could learn, and really inspired me, I think, to think about teaching seriously as a career and how I could engage students, young people, in a new, more inclusive way to the way that I had experienced music myself. So he made a huge impact on me, and I'm absolutely delighted that he's going to be our guest later. I was wondering, is there a moment in your life as a young person or a musician or adult that has changed the way you thought about things?
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying, actually, in terms of when this might happen to us as individuals as well. But for me, very briefly, there were two experiences. One was when I was at school, and there was a new music teacher at the school I was at, Poole Grammar School in Dorset, and a chap called Bob Hayden Gilbert came in as head of music. And before long, music had become about music and about sound and not about history and maths. Before that, it was reciting birth dates of composers and this and that. We'd have some lessons where he would just play the piano for the whole lesson or double lesson. And especially in the sixth form, because there were only two of us studying A-level music, myself and a chap called Chris Traves, who's an incredible producer and trombonist based in London. And it was just the two of us. And of course, it was typical, the music block was miles away from anywhere else in the school. So you could, you were sort of disconnected from the rest of the school, which was great. And it was just music. But Bob used to just play a lot. And that was really important for me. It became it sounds obvious, but it became about sound. And the second one was John Harle, the saxophonist, teacher, composer. While I was studying at Royal Northern College of Music in Manchester, I became part of the Apollo Saxophone Quartet. And at this point, we're talking about the mid to late 1980s. Saxophone was still a new instrument as a first study instrument in conservatoires in the UK. And there weren't really specialist teachers, so the RNCM, to give them a lot of credit, paid for the four of us in the Apollo Quartet to go to London, have these coaching sessions with John Harle. And John was, he had lots of ideas. He was an innovator. And in terms of the way he played the instrument, the way he listened to music. And I suppose essentially he was quite confrontational as well. He was very persuasive. But the wonderful thing was, because there were the four of us in the group, it was 4 against 1. So even though we were younger, we could actually discuss things afterwards between the four of us and swap ideas. I imagine it would have been pretty intense if it was regular one-to-one lessons at that point with John. Yeah. But he made us think, and he made us question. And so those two people I found to be, it's only, maybe you don't realise at the time.
No.
But I mean, maybe you did.
I don't think I did immediately, but with Ben, I think as the years went on, I started teaching, and then I started studying for my doctorate, and the ideas that Ben introduced me to, which we'll explore a little bit later on in our session, became very real to me in helping me frame my own teaching in such a way to engage young people through the music curriculum that I was planning. and teaching then with the technology that I was interested in at the time. So these people do shape our lives for certain.
Yeah,
so,
and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what Ben has to say after you've just said that.
Fantastic. Well, I'm absolutely delighted that Ben Higham is our guest today. Ben's a classically trained musician who, for the last 35 years, has worked as a professional performer in the fields of improvised, jazz, and popular contemporary musics. He's also a composer in these fields, including music for video and theatre. In 1985, Ben founded Community Music East, a community-based educational organisation, charity, and social enterprise, of which he was the director until December 2009. During this period, he led the development of community music practice and curriculum development for the training of community music teachers, tutors, and other professional musicians. As we've discussed, I met Ben in 1995 when he came to visit the University of East Anglia's postgraduate certificate in music education course, and I really enjoyed his sessions. So building on this long and distinguished career in community music education, Ben's now a consultant specialising in strategic planning and organisational development in the voluntary social enterprise sectors. Ben's business experience spans the commercial and not-for-profit sectors and informs his expertise in the management areas of strategy, operations, finances and personnel. Ben, thank you so much for coming along today and joining us on our podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. Yeah, it sounds all very grand. Now you read it out like that, yes.
Well, you've done an awful lot, and I'm conscious that we're only going to be able to touch on some elements of your work today, but we really do appreciate your time, so thank you again for coming along. I wanted to just take you back to 1995 and to the experiences that I outlined earlier at the university that were so influential in my own musical development and my own musical learning. Can you give us an insight into the types of community music practices that you've been working on over the years and how they have led to this inclusive way of engaging people with music?
Well, okay. I mean, I think that it very much goes back to an experience I had probably in 1984, which was the opportunity to go to a workshop that was being run by an organisation at that time called the National Jazz Outreach Centre at the local arts centre here in Norwich. And I got a sudden insight, a bit like yours, probably a bit later, in terms of how things could be if we were actually kind of exploring music in a kind of an inclusive and a kind of collective way that actually enabled us to experience all sorts of activities that are both skill and creatively focused. So, but we're doing something together. That was the thing that was really fascinating for me about that experience. And that led to me becoming involved with that group of people who eventually turned into community music and led to me setting up Community Music East in Norfolk a year later. And so it was that aspect of kind of the collective experience of individuals that helped to make a group and engage them in that process that I found really interesting. I, like you, come from originally a classically trained background. So I've always been interested in the idea that we share sort of responsibility for how music is made, and we don't necessarily just always operate in these very sort of distinct roles of this person keeps the beat and this person does that. The more we're involved in some, sorry, I don't know if you can hear that, but hang just one sec. Paul, we're actually recording something here. Sorry, can you just give us, I know, I understand, but just for half an hour.
Carry on, Paul.
Well done, Paul.
This is it. Sorry, I haven't got a door on my cave here.
Don't worry.
Yeah, sorry. I can't remember.
So you were talking a bit about how we're moving beyond people having individual roles within an ensemble.
Yeah, that notion, which had also been my kind of experience in the music making I'd done up until that point, was this idea about how we work together, and it was my kind of work in sort of jazz and some popular music making was actually probably more intuitive, because I was working with lots of people who weren't necessarily classically trained players themselves. So that seemed to be an environment that was more familiar to them than it might have been to me or people who come from my background. So in that way, I was kind of intrigued that it became in some ways specific. And that was what was so fascinating about the concepts that John came up with that have been kind of captured in this book. I say kind of, we'll come back to that in a way.
Yeah.
But the ideas that he had for compositions, which then proved so kind of intriguing and useful in terms of developing collective knowledge that builds the individual, was really interesting.
Well, you've mentioned a book there, which, as you say, we're going to discuss, which is John Stevens' book, Search and Reflect. I've got a reissued copy of it here. It was republished by Rock School back in 2013, I think, although I'm not sure it's currently available, but it is a really kind of seminal book, I think, for many of us, and contains exercises and ideas for pieces of music that are freely improvised. Perhaps, Ben, it would be great if you could just give us an overview of that book and how it shaped your ideas, and in particular how it's developed your own practice in this area.
Okay. It's interesting. The ideas shaped me rather than the book.
Okay.
I think.
Okay.
And that's why I'll come back to the book in a bit. In that the book has kind of captured a lot of those ideas, but the way in which I understood them and the way in which we used them was to make the music rather than to read about it, if you see what I mean.
Yes, I do, yeah.
And so there is a kind of progressive process in each of the pieces. And one of the other things that really struck me about it, which I've always been quite sort of persistent about, I suppose, in any work, is that we're always talking about playing pieces rather than any exercises or anything like that. So everything is a preparation for the next bit. Everything, if you like, is a rehearsal. We do, from that point of view, it's helpful for us to focus and be as attentive as possible to trying to do whatever it is that we've set out to do. At the same time, if it all goes wrong, it doesn't really matter. We just start and we do it again. So it's about creating a focused, enthusiastic activity, but at the same time, we're trying to minimize the kind of the problem, the mistakes, if you like, or the implications of the mistakes, which maybe would intimidate people. So we're trying to take that away. Yeah, it's more fun, and the more fun it gets, the more genuine energy goes into the actual process of collaborating with each other to make it work. That makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so my forgive me, but my learning of that repertoire was all physical. It was all in the space. It was nothing to do with the actual book. And but I'm quite sympathetic to the idea of why they wanted to try and capture that. I think it was kind of, though it's all John's work, it was something that was kind of counterintuitive to John's thinking, because again, it was all about being there and doing it in a way. So other folk, I think it was Julia Doyle and Ollie, who were very, I've forgotten Ollie's name now. Oh dear, he'll never forgive me. But anyway, it was their job to kind of write it down, really, and get the process. But these were all actually pieces of John's that he wanted people to play. They're embedded in spontaneous music ensemble. There's a lot of that sort of stuff was there, and that's also how he would, I understand, is how he would sort of build his groupings up. So it's not exclusive to just working with people in a workshop. It's a creative music making process.
Well, I mean, personally, I'm really pleased that they were written down. And, John sadly is no longer with us, and his ideas in this book have allowed me to develop my own way of teaching music back in the late 1990s and early 2000s when I was teaching in school, and trying to think about how when I say informality of the process, that's probably the wrong word, but how the ideas associated with free musical improvisation translated across into a more formal setting like a classroom were a major part of my own studies for my own PhD. So, yes, it's I can understand that people have what's the right word? Different views about how their work might be represented, and the formality of a book maybe is not in the spirit of the way in which the exercises or the pieces would have been developed in his own practice. But at least it has that legacy for us.
Indeed. And I mean, all I would say, it was interesting. We used to have conversations sort of back in the 90s and then no time for them ever since, but about the idea that we needed to develop another manual to actually show people how to use the first manual.
Right.
See what I mean? It sounds
Yes.
Gerard Hoffman, doesn't it? It's
Yes.
not going to get crazy. But yeah, that I think the concern was that really that an understandable pressure in, say, something like the classroom is do something quite quickly. There's not much time to do that before we have to go on and do the other thing. Whereas the time we had to work with people in these non-classroom situations, and I think that's actually quite important in terms of much of my community music activity, is it wasn't in the classroom. Even if it was in school, it was more often than not working with the children who were learning or the young people who were learning music in schools. It was often engaged with working with children at risk of exclusion, for instance.
Yes.
And it was about a way of engaging, of enthusing, and you needed the time and space for that. So your period would be 2 hours, not 30 minutes or 40 minutes.
Yes.
These are the tensions that, in a sense, are slightly my concern with how this material might be viewed or seen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just jumping in there, Ben. I'm interested what you said about the sort of time, having the time to really develop something. But what about the level of expectation as well? Because I mean, when I'm just start a rehearsal with a drummer, I work with Dave Hassel, and we're just improvising, and nothing is discussed.
Mm-hmm.
It's fine. We've got that trust and confidence because we've been playing together a long time. Something might really take off, something might not. But when you're working with a group for the first time, how do you kind of introduce them to it? Or, and as I said, in terms of level of expectation or not?
Right. Well, that's precisely it, Andy. Really, it's this notion of let's try something. What we're not doing is saying we're going to start here and we're going to end here. We're saying let's do this, and then let's do this, which happens to be a development from what we did before. But what we've done is kind of rehearse something and explore it and understood how it works and where it doesn't work, why it doesn't work, what we're trying to kind of do in terms of get right. Could be as simple as some sort of rhythmic exercise, but there's kind of an engagement in it. We're all part of something. Could be a circle where we're all clapping or something like that. We're trying to keep a rhythm. We're thinking about what timekeeping might be, etc., etc. And it doesn't matter. It breaks down. Then someone starts it, and they also have, some kind of control because it's going to go this way. I start it. The next person sets the time, etc. So suddenly there are these kind of elements that increasingly people become involved in, and then you can build up elements that create a structure that you improvise over, which is, if you like, building a vernacular, which is exactly what you have with Dave when you start improvising with him. We've learned something as improvisers that we start to use, and then we start to kind of push the boundary on that. And that's exactly, even at that point of clapping, we're pushing a boundary, and it doesn't matter if it goes wrong. And the more it doesn't matter that it goes wrong, the more likely it is.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I guess it's that level of listening, a really kind of deep listening, and just being totally present and in the moment, and that reaction, speed of reaction. And that's fascinating.
And as it kind of, there's nothing like that thing of, I mean, we were doing some workshops. We were kindly asked to do something with more music up in Morecambe, not that far away from where you are. A couple of 2 or 3 weeks ago, we were there, my colleague, prior to a gig we were doing, and I was asked to do a couple of workshops in schools, and it was really interesting. But you had 25 people in a group, and the first thing that happens is that once you've clapped, Are you thinking about tonight? Are you wondering how you're going to text your mate or whatever? And suddenly it's round again, and until you're in the space and you're present, that's going to happen. It's going to go wrong every time. But it doesn't matter until you realize that this is where you need to be, not somewhere else.
And surely that's going to help for other areas of life.
Absolutely.
Just like, because I mean, I don't want to get onto a rant and interrupt the thread here, but why don't more people understand why don't more people understand the benefits of what we're discussing now with young people or whoever, not even young people? I mean, what's your not your take on that, but experiences or thoughts?
Well, my view, my take on it, and my experience of that is to absolutely agree with you. But I suppose it is, to a great extent, it's about time and resources. This is always the kind of challenge, really. And it's whether or not the environment is sympathetic to that opportunity being taken. And it's interesting how you phrase that, Andy, because that's the other element of what we were doing, is that it's about people developing stuff. What we did in the workshop was only valuable because those people were there doing it, and they come out of that feeling better in themselves for being part of something that enabled that to happen, which meant they had to do something with other people. So that is a kind of a personal developmental process that actually only works collectively. I mean, it helps the individual carrying on and doing that, but those experiences are really significant because they happen to lots of people at the same time in slightly different ways, at slightly different paces. Doesn't matter. That's the other thing, is that it doesn't matter how fast or how slow things happen. But that it is about a personal development process which happen, and music is great as a vehicle for doing for achieving those kind of outcomes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
But that's not necessarily the focus of what music education is now. So there's a lot of language surrounding it all. I don't know if we're jumping ahead here, but there's a lot of language surrounding how this what we want to achieve, inclusivity and creativity and all those sorts of things. But it's a question of how much time you're going to actually have to be able to achieve those things, which have a broader than a subject-specific area, which is not about me, the musician, but is about some kind of music that I'm supposed to play somehow that may or may not be mine. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a question of whether or not I can play that music better for having had the kind of experiences I've had, if you see what I mean.
Yes, absolutely.
Confidence, in me as an individual, or someone as an individual. Sorry.
No, that's great. That's really interesting. I was
brilliant.
I was thinking about while you were talking about the workshops in Morecambe, about the challenges that music teachers in schools face, which are obviously a different set of issues, that things have to be measurable and achievable within a shorter time frame, and they have to give an account of their students' progression and development. If not every week, certainly maybe every half a term, or it's a mechanistic assessment kind of process driven by things that are often outside of those teachers' control. How do teachers respond to these ideas when you've been into schools recently and done this type of work?
Well, I have to say, I mean, to be honest, I'm not doing it very frequently recently because I'm mainly just writing and trying to secure funding and do those sorts of things around making music these days. But just that experience was really enjoyable for me. And I really did appreciate the fact that the teachers were prepared to have us come in and do something with their pupils, the young people in the room, because I realized how much pressure there is on that time and what the expectations there are. So I mean, I thought that was terrific that they were interested in what was happening there, and the conversations I had with the teachers we worked with, they were very sympathetic to the ideas that we were exploring there. They were also seeing how they could take some of these ideas forward and how valuable they thought it was. So I thought, in some ways, I see that as actually, very bold and very brave of the teachers to do that, because I do believe it's a very confined and increasingly resource poor environment in which they're having to work.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that is difficult.
You mentioned, by way of examples, the rhythmic exercise and clapping and the circle and
Piece.
the piece. Sorry, I keep saying exercise. The piece. Yes, you mentioned that piece. I just wondered for our listeners whether you could give us maybe an example or two of some other pieces that you would use in those settings, and maybe something with a melodic bass or a harmonic bass potentially, just by way of contrast.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm just thinking of some things that we actually did with the groups, which were very interesting, because one of the things there was that you actually had a very broad range of music skills across the group. Within one school, we were looking at the pre-GCSE group, and so they were all of a year group. And within the other school, it was actually something like 12s to 18s, which was kind of also really, really interesting. But in both groups, you obviously had lots of people who had kind of more or less levels of skill on their instruments and so on. But they bought in absolutely to the collaborative bit of, this is what we're doing, this is how we're making music together. So an example of two pieces, interestingly enough, neither of which are actually in that book, but are actually pieces that have evolved from it and are actually quite popular, particularly in quite a short space of time, which is all we had. We had 2 hours in kind of each situation, and that was barely long enough. But we got to a point where in one workshop, we were using a piece that had become quite popular, which is a piece called 3-4-5. And basically you divide the group up. One group is you're using a common beat, and one group is describing that space physically by a clap initially on the first beat of whichever group you're in. So one group is clapping 1, 2, 3, 1, and another group is clapping 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, and similar for the fives. And you've done your maths, I'm sure, and you know that at a certain point it all comes back together again, because you've got a common whatever it is.
I'm trying to work it out.
Yeah, that's all right. I'll let you just work.
It might be 30. Yeah. I think it might be 30.
Fours don't go to 30.
Oh, they don't. No, fours don't go into
30.
60, maybe 60. Yeah.
Well done.
Well done, Andy.
So it's 60 beats and 1, and then you've got this. This quite complex thing, and then you work on that. You practice the first and last beats, so you've got this quite complex rhythm. So you're already in sort of Terry Riley. You've got phasing going on. You've got all sorts of interesting stuff going on. Then you kind of perhaps get the groups each to invent little patterns that actually describe those spaces: 3 beats, 4 beats, or 5 beats, which they then repeat. So you're increasingly into really quite complex musical structures, but all you're really doing is playing your bit and listening to what's happening with the others. And the more you do it, the more you hear what's happening around you, because you're more confident in what you're playing in order to create that space. Then that could be a vehicle for an improvisation space before perhaps this kind of chorus comes back in. So you start playing with these compositional ideas. Yeah. And so that one appeals in that sort of situation, because quite quickly there is quite a lot of structure to it, whereas there are some other pieces which we also used perhaps prior to that, where we were looking at just playing as fast as we possibly could in order to create activity that we're not really having to think about, but we're just thinking, how that actually works in a kind of painterly way, if you know what I mean. So you're creating sort of colors and textures rather than playing in this scale or those notes or whatever it might be. And then there can be other pieces where, you're asking about harmonically. Quite often you don't actually use much structured harmonically based activity, because the judgments about the rights and wrongs of sound and how the sounds mingle is kind of more interestingly left up to the to the groups, and then it's a vehicle for some kind of conversation about what have we heard and what does it sound like. So you're actually developing that critical impulse in the participants, who are actually making their own judgments about how that worked and how that worked again and how that's changed since we started doing it half an hour ago. And that, those sorts of things are defined by people's responses, rather than us saying, okay, got it right finally, sort of thing. Another example of a piece that works really well is I've forgotten the name of it. It'll come back to me by the time I finish describing it. But it's a piece which is all defined by breath length. Everybody's breath length is different. So you could sing it, or you could play it, or a combination of any of those. You just take a breath and you play a note, say if on a brass instrument, or you sing a note if you're vocalizing, and you hold it for as long as you've got a breath. Then you take a breath and you repeat that, because you made it as a comfort decision. Your decision to change that, the emphasis is because it's more comfortable to sing something different. Now, later you can have a conversation about what influenced that idea of comfort. Is it physical, or was it musical, or was it are these compositional judgments that you're making? How interesting was it when you changed your note expecting something to happen, then everybody else changed their note, and so it's all kind of starting all over again. But you also get this it's called sustain, I've remembered. Sorry,
it's a good name.
These days. The whole thing does sustain itself because the breaths keep overlapping. So it sustains, it evolves. I remember once we recorded 45 people doing this. It's just extraordinary, kind of glorious experience. And that was it. And that's all they were doing. That's all had been suggested that they were doing.
Yes.
But what ended up was just something extraordinary.
Thank you. That was really interesting.
These are the sorts of things that can happen. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. No. Really, really lovely to hear those examples. Thank you, Ben. I think we're drawing towards the end of our discussion, sadly. But I wanted to ask you a little bit just about the current state of music education in the UK today. As you know, there are some significant changes underfoot in relation to the way in which music education is organised, with the redesignation of the music education hubs, which the Arts Council are currently doing, and various other things that are happening. As somebody who's worked in this sector for a long time, how do you reflect on the state of music education today, the challenges that we're facing, and the way in which things seem to be evolving?
Okay. My observations are very general here, because I'm not that bound up with what's going on. So I'm both intrigued and alarmed to hear what you're describing. But I am aware that there are kind of pressures on this notionally evolutionary sort of process of how music might be being, or the teaching of music might be resourced, really. I see a progression to this through various significant changes. I touched on that in a kind of email I sent back to you earlier on, really. There have been various pressures on how things have worked, because the effectiveness of the approaches to music education have been increasingly sort of been driven by being more kind of notionally more egalitarian, but actually this has kind of overwhelmed the actual physical experience and kind of intellectual experience of of learning and playing music. In my book, it's just become something else that has sort of driven opportunities, and it's tended to be quite sort of possibly quite short term, in that there are simpler solutions, often technological ones, but I think the technological ones are very attractive, but they can become very strict and kind of defining in a way. So you still need that space for what we've just been talking about,
Yes.
that, the development of the individual as such. I mean, in a way, the idea that AI writes music is probably not that potentially surprising or not that uninteresting, perhaps, in terms of what music they might write, whether actually that's interesting in terms of the more creative thinking around what popular music might be and those kinds of things. That's another thing. Sorry, I'm kind of rambling a bit here, but what concerns me probably is that the shift away from the experience of music as a kind of core part of the curriculum, and I suspect that's increasingly less the case, and that experience of music in terms of people development is something that is kind of so valuable, and if it's demoted in a way, then that is I think that's a problem for a kind of broader educational experience for people. And also, if it then becomes only driven by the sorts of circumstances you describe in terms of the accountability for the teaching of it, then that's not really an accountability for the learning of it, is it? In the sense of, how people have developed. It's only about what apparently has been achieved. And obviously there's so much more than that that somehow needs to be captured. But this kind of obsessive, slightly evidence-based approach, I suppose, that would slightly concern me. And also, of course, I mean, I'm pre-national curriculum. I remember when actually teachers could actually be much more liberated in terms of doing what they want.
Yes.
And most of the really significant experiences that everybody kind of recounts from their teaching, their school experience is normally back in the times when those teachers could be so sort of influential. So that sounds a bit harsh. I'm sure that's not actually the case, but I do believe that many teachers that I know have kind of stopped teaching because that's not what they can do.
Right. Well, thank you so much for that reflection on that question, and it's something that we're asking.
Can I just say I do think the teachers do a fantastic job. This is not about that; it's about what the expectations are. So I'm not.
Ben, do you think it's because of the subjectivity that's related to something like music? It's not just a yes or no answer, is it? I guess. Do you think that's a big influence on the way things have developed with music education?
Well, I mean, I suppose people might imagine that. I mean, there was a time when you could do things together, and that performance could be actually understood, and that could be achieved. But you could also look to support the individual pathways that people were involved in. So, their own personal growth was something that you could support as a teacher. You may just capture it in kind of some sort of ensemble situation. And I'm sure teachers are sympathetic to this now.
Yes.
It's just the amount of time and resource they have that can enable them to be engaged in supporting that at an individual level is constrained. So I wouldn't say it's subjective in this. It's more about kind of an individual's personal development, but that doesn't happen in isolation. No, I think that's the core, really.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we certainly celebrate music teachers in our podcast and the work that they do, and in an episode which we're going to be releasing shortly, we're going to be interviewing somebody who's got a really important role in the way in which young people develop from musicians into teachers, which will be interesting to discuss with him. Ben, thank you so much for your thoughts this morning. We've really enjoyed chatting to you. As you know, in each of our podcasts, we feature some new music, and I'm delighted that you've selected a piece of music for us to listen to today. Would you like to introduce what you've chosen for the podcast?
Yes. Well, this is a piece well, like lots of pieces of mine, they've been floating around my head for years, decades, some of them. But anyway, this one has come into shape relatively recently as part of the repertoire of a band I have called the Brass Monkeys, which is 7 horns and a drummer, and they're wonderful players and play. I really enjoy playing with them. And we've just recorded an album, and this is the title track from that album, and it's called Lullaby.
Fantastic.
You want me to qualify at all? I think it speaks for itself. Soothing but slightly disturbing, perhaps.
Well, here we go with Lullaby.
Oh, I love it. I really do. I'm fascinated by. I've listened to when you sent your music through. Actually, Ben, I've listened to it a few times. I just love. It sounds simplistic, maybe, but I just love the sounds, and the way that there seems to be a tension created with the lovely writing and the horns, but then with this kind of freedom of the sounds that the drums are creating, and I find myself drawn into it. So, yeah, what was your? Sorry, sounds like a very silly question, but what was your thinking when you were composing that? Can you remember what were some ideas going through your head? How did it come to be?
Well, it's kind of interesting. It was an idea that developed from quite an early band I had, actually, and it's been sort of floating around in different forms, and I think it's finally found a kind of a really good form. But that was a 9-piece band, and so I had this idea of nines, and I was also kind of playing with there's a kind of a really ancient game of stones and grids and stuff called 9-Man Morris. I don't know if you've ever come across it.
I've heard of that, yeah.
Well, that was sort of something that we were playing here with the kids at home and all the rest, quite a lot. So all of these ideas of nines kept coming around, and I don't know if you've got the idea, but all the themes are in 9-bar sort of phrases, and then they all kind of pile up on each other at some point or other. So that kind of 9 idea was quite a strong one. And then it's just a piece that's been hovering in my head in some shape or form to be revisited, and it kind of came out like this, quite different to. Well, I mean, similar in certain ways. There are sort of melodic elements that are the same, but the way in which we perform it now is kind of slightly different.
And you said it being sort of hovering in your head. How did you then sort of extract that? Do you sit at a piano, or do you do it all by ear, or do you use manuscript, or?
I mainly use trumpets or things like that to write them, and manuscript. Yes, I'm a latecomer to Sibelius, which is great now, but everything else used to be written by hand.
Yeah.
But these days nobody can read my script.
No, fabulous. Thanks for giving us a kind of brief insight into your music. Loved it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ben.
Great.
It's been an absolute pleasure having you on our podcast, Ben. Been great to catch up with you after all these years. Thank you so much for coming along. And if you've enjoyed our discussion with Ben, please consider subscribing to our podcast. Our next episode will be along very shortly. Goodbye.
Goodbye.